Welcome to the Deep Dive. We aim to get straight to the heart of complex ideas, giving you, the essential insights without all the jargon.
Glad to be diving in.
Today we're tackling something that sounds maybe a bit academic at first, the dissolution of the Oedipus complex in psychoanalytic theory. But honestly, it unlocks some surprising things about how our minds work.
That's right. We're mainly drawing from a really interesting 1987 paper by Aaltonen and Räkköläinen. It appeared in the Scandinavian Psychoanalytic Review, and it really makes you rethink some core psychoanalytic ideas.
Okay, so our mission for this deep dive, it's kind of twofold, and it centers on a bit of a puzzle. First, why did Freud use such strong words, like dissolution, even destruction, for the Oedipus complex, not just, say, resolution?
Good question.
And second, how does this whole intense process connect with Winnicott's concept of paradox? They might seem unrelated, but the sources suggest they're actually deeply linked. We think this could lead to some real aha moments.
Exactly. Let's jump into that first point, then, Freud's choice of words. In, I think it was 1924, he uses these specific German terms, Untergang and Zerstörung.
Dissolution and destruction.
Right. Dissolution and destruction. It signals something much more drastic than just, a problem being solved.
Yeah, resolve sounds neat, manageable. Destruction sounds like, well, like something is completely taken apart, annihilated almost.
Precisely. It implies a fundamental breakdown, not just a working through. And this is where paradox comes in, but maybe not the first kind you'd think of.
Okay.
The paper discusses two kinds of paradox. First, there's the type based on Kuhlmann's work in psychoanalysis. It's like a statement that seems contradictory but holds a truth.
Like feeling love and hate for someone at the same time.
Exactly like that. Or, those simultaneous opposites, inside, outside, me, not me, good, bad. The idea is the child often manages the anxiety of holding both by splitting them apart mentally.
Ah, okay. So seeing a parent is perfectly wonderful one moment and then maybe completely terrible the next, as a way to cope with those mixed feelings.
That's the idea. These paradoxes, they sort of exist on the same psychological level, and defenses like splitting can theoretically handle them.
Got it. But then the paper introduces a different kind of paradox. This one comes from Logic, Whitehead, and Russell, Theory of Logical Types. Sounds a bit heavier.
It is more abstract, yeah, but it's key here. The basic idea is about discontinuity. A class or a category can't logically be a member of itself.
Okay, try that again.
Think about it like this. You have a box labeled all boxes that don't contain themselves. Does that box contain itself? If it does, it shouldn't. If it doesn't, it should. It creates a loop.
Ah, okay. Like the classic examples. The Cretan saying, all Cretans are liars.
Exactly. Or the sign saying, ignore this sign. If you obey it, you disobey it.
Right, those real mind-bending ones where there's no simple yes or no. The paper points out they're self-referential, right? And they create this illusion of choice, but there's no real way out on that level.
Precisely. You can't resolve them within their own terms. The only way is to jump to a meta level, a higher level of thinking about the paradox. Wittgenstein actually stressed just accepting these are inherently unresolvable.
Okay, interesting. So where does the double bind fit into all this? That sounds more like relationships, communication.
Well, it connects directly to that second type of paradox. Bateson and his colleagues developed the double bind theory initially from observing families with members diagnosed with schizophrenia. It happens when this logical discontinuity, this difference between levels, isn't respected in human communication.
And that can cause psychological problems.
Yes, significant ones. The theory describes these paradoxical communication patterns.
Okay, can you break down the key ingredients of a double bind?
Sure. Typically, you have a primary negative injunction, like, don't do X or you'll be punished. Simple enough. Then you get a secondary injunction, often nonverbal, maybe tone of voice, a gesture, but it's on a more abstract level and it conflicts with the first one. It might imply, you should do X, or you shouldn't see the first message as a threat.
Ah, a mixed message, but on different levels.
Exactly. And crucially, there's a third element. A kind of tertiary injunction preventing the person from leaving the situation, from escaping the field. They feel trapped, forced to respond, but any response is wrong because of the paradox.
Wow. So you're damned if you do, damned if you don't, and you can't even point out the contradiction or leave.
That's the core of it. It creates this illusion of choice, but can lead to panic, rage, confusion, because there's no logical right move.
In the paper's big leap is saying this doesn't just happen between people. It can happen inside our own minds. Intrapsychically.
Precisely. And that is potentially the key to understanding why Freud talked about the destruction of the Oedipus complex. It's like an internal trap.
Okay, so this internal no-win situation,
Yeah.
that helps explain why Freud felt the Oedipus complex couldn't just be neatly resolved. Let's go back to Freud's own words.
Right. He talked about its destruction from its lack of success, from the effects of its internal impossibility. He even compared it to how milk teeth fall out, naturally, but decisively.
Internal impossibility. That sounds exactly like this internal paradox or double-bind idea.
Yeah.
So what creates this impossibility within the Oedipal phase itself?
Well, Freud pointed to a few things coming together. The child's burgeoning sexuality, specifically genital feelings, their intense emotional bonds with parents, and their growing imaginative capacities.
The potent mix.
Very. And the paper highlights how Freud himself seemed to, well, oscillate between different explanatory framework, sometimes biological, like hereditary factors, sometimes psychological, the famous castration anxiety idea, perhaps sparked by seeing anatomical differences, and sometimes transactional, seeking parental approval, fearing disapproval.
So the child is getting conflicting signals, maybe even from within themselves, based on these different levels: biology, psychology, relationships.
Exactly. The paper argues the child's ego is faced with incompatible alternatives. A desire for one parent might clash with the fear of the other, or even with an internal sense of this is wrong. It creates an internal double bind.
And like you said before, because it's internal, the child can't just walk away from the playground. There's no leaving the field.
That's the critical point for the intrapsychic version. The paper suggests the secondary injunction here is like the child internally saying, I do not recognize this, about their own emerging sexuality and Oedipal feelings.
So it's not just wanting something forbidden, it's a deeper conflict about the nature of the wanting itself.
Yes, it's more than just opposing forces. It's self-reflective. The awareness creates the impossibility. And the usual defenses, like splitting people into all good or all bad, or just pushing feelings down repression, they don't quite work because the paradoxical nature of it all isn't coherent enough to be neatly repressed or split off.
Which brings us back to Freud saying it's more than repression, a destruction and an abolition of the complex. So if repression isn't enough, how does the child get out of this internal trap?
The paper suggests the healthy way out isn't a logical solution, but what they term a creative leap or a simple bind resolution. Because the other paths are blocked, the ego basically just turns away from the Oedipus complex.
Turns away, like choosing not to engage with the paradox anymore.
In a sense, yes. It's a psychological dismantling of the paradoxical situation, like the milk teeth falling out. It's a developmental necessity. And fascinatingly, the authors connect this turning away to the very development of abstract thought.
Wait, so grappling with this impossible internal paradox actually spurs the development of abstract thinking. How does that connection work?
The idea is that by confronting a situation that has no resolution on its current level, the mind is forced to operate at a higher level of abstraction, to think about the categories, not just within them. It's a jump to a meta level, conceptually speaking.
Huh. That's really interesting. And you mentioned Freud himself kind of bumped up against a similar conceptual problem.
Yes, with the concept of instinct. He famously placed it on the frontier between the mental and the somatic, neither purely mind nor purely body. That's inherently paradoxical, right?
It is, yeah. Hard to pin down.
And the paper links this to Winnicott's ideas about transitional phenomena, those things like security blankets that are somehow both internal creations and external objects. They exist in that in-between space.
And Freud later called instincts mythical entities, didn't he? Like axioms in science, fundamental but maybe unprovable within the system itself.
Exactly. He acknowledged their magnificent indefiniteness. It's like accepting the paradoxical nature at a higher conceptual level.
Okay, so this turning away is the healthy path. What happens if that doesn't quite work in what we might call neurotic development?
Well, in that case, the paper suggests the ego relies more heavily on repression alone. The complex isn't really dismantled or destroyed, it's pushed down, but it persists, unconsciously influencing things. The person stays kind of stuck in that internal double bind, perhaps still caught in the illusion of needing to make a choice within it.
And I guess actual double binds in the family environment could make that worse, make it harder to make that healthy turn away.
Absolutely. External realities can certainly complicate or hinder that internal developmental process. Healthy turning away isn't just forgetting, though. It involves a major internal shift.
Right. You mentioned Freud talked about giving up the intense attachments, the object affixes.
Yes, giving those up and replacing them with identifications. internalizing aspects of the parents, their rules, their authority. This forms the basis of the superego, the conscience.
And the energy gets redirected.
Right. The libidinal energy tied up in the complex gets desexualized, at least partially, and sublimated, channeled into other things like learning, hobbies, friendships. That ushers in the latency period. So the potential for adult sexuality remains, but its direct expression within that original family triangle is sort of neutralized.
Okay, this paints a much richer picture of dissolution. Now let's bring Winnicott more fully into this. You said he really focused on paradox.
He absolutely did. It's central to his thinking. He challenged that neat separation of inner world, outer world. For Winnicott, his concept of the transitional paradox is key. It's inherently unresolvable, yes, but unlike the potentially damaging double bind, it has a crucial positive role in development.
And it bridges the gap between the transactional paradoxes, like Beatson's double bind, and the intrapsychic ones we see in the Oedipus complex.
That's the argument. It acts as a kind of bridge.
So what is the core of Winnicott's transitional idea? The teddy bear example.
Yeah, the teddy bear, the special blanket. These transitional objects and the phenomena associated with them exist in this unique intermediate space. They're not just subjective fantasy, nor are they just objective reality.
That famous quote.
Right. The baby creates the object, but the object was there waiting to be created. It captures the paradox perfectly. It feels 100% created and real to the baby, but it also exists externally.
And being able to live in that both-hand space, to tolerate that paradox without needing to crush it, is vital.
Absolutely vital, according to Winnicott. If parents, for instance, can't respect that space, if they insist it's just a blanket or try to interpret it away too quickly, it can disrupt development. The value is in inhabiting that intermediate area.
And what is that positive value, specifically?
For Winnicott, this intermediate area is the source of so much richness in human life. It's the foundation for play, creativity, art, religious feeling, imaginative living, even creative scientific work. It's where inner and outer reality meet and play together.
So the transitional paradox acts as a kind of developmental training ground for handling ambiguity and complexity.
You could say that. It functions like a meta level, connecting the internal and external worlds. And it adds huge depth to the psychoanalytic concept of the holding environment. It's within this safe acceptance of paradox that the difficult dissolution of the Oedipus complex can happen more healthily.
The paper also gives some clinical and artistic illustrations, right? Can we touch on those briefly? They might help make this more concrete.
Sure. There's a clinical vignette about a patient who was very anxious about the analyst figuring something out about them too quickly before they were ready.
Ah, like a fear of that transitional space being intruded upon.
Exactly. Maybe reflecting earlier experiences where their inner reality wasn't allowed to just be. The eventual shift in the analysis, where associations flowed more freely, represented a kind of turning away from that fear, an acceptance of the process, the inherent uncertainties.
And the literary examples. Ibsen and Strindberg. Powerful stuff.
Very. In Ibsen's Peer Gynt, there's that line, "Though I hammer or am hammered, still we must have lamentations." It comes out of this incredibly intense, maybe suffocating mother-son bond. You can definitely see Oedipal themes and double-bind dynamics, like in the story about the blacksmith. Peer feels utterly trapped in these paradoxical binds.
That captures the feeling well. And Strindberg, a dream play.
Yes, there's a sadomasochistic marriage depicted, and this dialogue about a hairpin, how it's one thing but also made of two parts, illustrating unity and duality. It's a metaphor for their paradoxical relationship.
Another paradox.
Exactly. And the play even references the idea of scientific axioms, fundamental but unprovable truths, another kind of paradox at the heart of a system. In the play, the resolution comes through separation, which the paper interprets as a way of tolerating the unresolvability of their connection rather than trying to force a neat solution.
Okay, so let's try to bring this all together. We started with Freud's strong language dissolution destruction for the Oedipus complex. And we saw this linked not just to simple conflict, but to a specific kind of logical paradox, the kind that can create an internal double bind, an impossible situation inside the child's mind.
Right, where typical defenses aren't quite enough.
And the healthy way out isn't solving it, but this creative leap, this turning away, which actually seems to help develop abstract thought.
The crucial developmental step.
Then Winnicott comes in with his transitional paradox, that in-between space of the teddy bear, highlighting the positive developmental need to accept and live with unresolvable paradoxes. It acts as a bridge and a foundation for creativity.
Exactly. He adds that vital dimension of the positive value in embracing paradox, maybe more than Freud, who focus a bit more on what's lost or given up. That transitional space is where so much happens.
This has definitely been a deep dive. It makes you think, doesn't it? How often we look for those neat, tidy resolutions in life.
When maybe the richness lies elsewhere.
Right, maybe recognizing, even embracing the inherent contradictions and paradoxes might actually lead to deeper understanding.
Which leads us to a final thought for our listeners. Thinking about these ideas, the potentially unresolvable nature of some core conflicts, the value of transitional spaces, where else in your life might this apply? Maybe in creative work or complex relationships or even just personal growth. Could accepting inherent paradoxes rather than fighting for a simple resolution actually open up new ways of seeing things, new possibilities? Definitely something to mull over.